So, kicking things off for today, we have a dynamic duo from TPX Impact, senior service designers Christine Browne and Louise Mushet. Christine brings a strategic powerhouse of experience with a PhD in computer and information science and roots as a qualified librarian. She excels at driving transformation. Louise, with a decade in design, is on a mission to make products and services accessible for all as a passionate advocate for inclusive design. They are here to take us beyond discovery with their talk, A Service Designer's Guide to Agile Delivery. Put your hands together, go crazy, and give a massive wild welcome to Louise and Christine. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you for choosing to join us this morning. We're Christine and Louise, senior service designers from TPX Impact, and we're here to share how service designers can stay involved and add value after discovery ends. So first, we'd like to start by introducing ourselves, and it's not as impressive as that intro that you just gave us. So I'm Christine Browne, and I work mainly in UK central government. I'm known as a pragmatic optimist and a bit of a data geek.
And I'm Louise Mushet. I love working in public and third sector organisations, and I'm a self-proclaimed discovery or disco diva. So who are TPX Impact, the company that we work with? They're an amalgamation of lots of companies. Some of you might recognise from the design past, like FutureGov or Different, but we all came together because we all recognised that we had a passion around people-powered digital transformation. These are some of the lovely clients that we get to work with that are based across the public and third sector, and we'll be pulling out some examples of our experience of working with them in this presentation. We work across 4 main areas. So design is Christine and I's bag, where we work to understand problems, define challenges, and come up with solutions and opportunities. With data, we try to make it easy for people to find, access, and use. With experience, we work to engage with our audiences across digital platforms. And with technology, we're working to build high quality and scalable systems and services.
So Louise, what are we doing outside of discovery?
I don't know.
Discovery often finishes with brilliant research and clear user needs. But then as we move through alpha and beta, we start making assumptions about how users will behave. Sometimes those assumptions turn out to be spot on, but sometimes they don't. So, quick question for everyone. When was the last time you finished discovery work, handed it over to a delivery team, and then what? Where did you go? What did you do next? If you're anything like us in some of our client spaces, you probably started another discovery project with a brand new client. Or maybe you hung about around the edges, asking, how's it going? And you get a polite, dismissive, yeah, fine, thanks, in return.
And that's because discovery is a service designer's ultimate comfort zone. We're so good at taking the time to really understand the problems before we jump to the solutions, really get into the grips of the why before we get to the how, that we just trust that by the time we get to this magical to-be state, we can just let it go and sail off into the sunset without us. But we're starting to learn that's not always the case. Because if you're not there to advocate for those marvellous discovery outputs like your user journeys, blueprints, needs, maps, they can get lost or forgotten about or not continued with. So how can we reintroduce ourselves across the whole process?
And here's something else we're starting to realise. A lot of teams treat service design like it's a phase that you complete, rather than a way of thinking that gets more valuable as complexity increases. It's kind of like training really brilliant detectives and then sending them home just as the real mystery begins.
So we all know, well, I'm assuming we all know the phases of Agile, discovery, alpha, beta, and live, which map quite nicely to the service designer's best friend, the double diamond. And they make sense. We're understanding the problem, then building the solutions, as I said, starting with the why before we jump to the how. But again, like, why are we often excluded from the second half when the real work begins?
Well, Louise, here's what we've learned from staying involved throughout entire project life cycles. Those user journeys that we mapped in Discovery, they keep revealing new things as we build. The pain points that we identified, they show up in unexpected ways when real functionality takes shape. So what we design must be built. What if service design isn't a phase you complete, but a lens that becomes more useful as the complexity increases? Alpha throws up new questions about user behaviour. Beta reveals nuances we couldn't predict. Live shows us what actually happens when real people use our services. Thinking back to the potato example in this morning's keynote. We can stay involved and genuinely useful throughout delivery, not by creating more meetings and not by slowing things down, but by proving that design thinking becomes much more valuable when you're actually building. So any delivery managers in the audience, have you found yourself in alpha and beta, wishing you had clearer insights into how users might react? Any developers in the room, would it be helpful if instead of users want to pay easily, you had users need payment confirmation within 3 seconds on mobile because they live complicated lives and exist in distracting environments? Scrum Masters, what if your sprint reviews included observations about how real users experience what we've built? When we keep user-focused thinking alive throughout delivery, it doesn't slow things down. It helps us make better decisions faster. Not because we're adding process, but because we're working with better information. So keeping service design thinking alive doesn't make Agile delivery more complicated. It makes it more agile.
And that's not to say it's easy. I'm sure there are some common challenges we're going to share with you that we've experienced that some of you might recognise. The first being that service design is often considered human and planet-centred, not specifically product-centred, which can clash with Agile being a product-centric process, and we're often plopped into product-centric teams. Where do we find our place within that?
Another common challenge is that prototyping and beyond is seen as a UX job, not a service design job, which can mean we're often left out of important conversations in development. The thing that's being designed can become much more siloed, and we start to lose those links with bigger picture thinking of how the service should work and what the service designers can bring.
A lot of service design tasks and what we do can be seen as intangible and high level, quite tricky to articulate or capture on a Jira ticket, for example, which can then also make it quite hard for us to demonstrate our value immediately as well.
Quite often, product teams are unsure how to utilise service designers, and it's often left to us to figure out for ourselves.
Which is then compounded by the fact that alpha and beyond are quite unfamiliar spaces for us service designers, and we don't often know how to best utilise ourselves.
So now I'm going to go into a deeper example of a project which I joined 3 weeks before public beta launch. It was for a Welsh government digital application portal project, a service helping citizens apply for government programmes. The team had brilliant discovery outputs, user research, service maps, identified pain points. But when building, the original service designer on the project was moved to a role of greater responsibility within the Agile team, which is something of a trend when you're working in these environments. And nobody had been focusing on the service design. I know from an earlier keynote speak that this might sound familiar to a lot of you in the room. So here's what I inherited when I landed 3 weeks before public beta launch. 62 user stories which lacked acceptance criteria, 3 separate bug tracking systems, no clear process translating user needs into technical requirements, and finally, a set of business processes that existed only in people's heads. There was no documentation, but there was a backlog of complex user journeys requiring simultaneous development. So this isn't bad design, it's real-life complexity. But when you've got 3 weeks to launch and the developers are asking, what exactly do you want us to build? That beautiful discovery work doesn't really help. So the issue here, with what you can see on screen with visualization, the issue wasn't the complexity. It's that the complexity, it wasn't translatable.
And then for me, in my context, I'd been pulled into an alpha project, having not been part of the discovery, where it was my job to then translate all of the discovery output to get it ready for piloting and testing. It was an 18-month-long project, which is also the longest project I've ever been part of. So I really had to maintain momentum, stamina, and have like a long-term strategic view of how my work could be implemented as part of that roadmap. And I was also in this really big team of loads of people like product managers, service owners, delivery managers, design leads, and all other types of designers. Me as a lone service designer, I was like, cool, how do I best bring in my skills to help complement but also contrast what the rest of the team are doing?
So now we'd like to introduce to you our service design guide to Agile delivery. We want you to leave with 7 practical tools that you can use next week. Real techniques, tested under pressure, with deadlines and budget constraints. But first, one more thing to think about in your heads as we go through these. What could change in your organisation if service designers were seen as essential throughout that Agile delivery process and not just helpful at the beginning? Because that's what we're here to help you achieve.
But it can be really overwhelming, and we're like, well, where do we actually start? So if you are new to a new stage of a project, I'm going to say some really basic and obvious things, but sometimes it's just good to be reminded of them and give yourself permission to go back and do the obvious. So the first one being, read your project brief, whether that's a statement of work, an invitation to tender, a contract, whatever that may be. Go back through it with a fine-tooth comb to see what's actually been agreed and promised to the people that you're working with, and how can you, depending on your role, pull out the specific things that can help that thing be achieved.
Another basic one, but it's always a goodie whenever you feel overwhelmed in the project team, read your job description. Check what skills and responsibilities could be pulled into your role.
Digest the discovery materials. So as I mentioned, I personally wasn't part of the discovery that I'd then inherited. So go back through and see, well, do you have a master deck? Where's all your research? Where are all the outputs, the needs, the epics, the Jira board? Go back through all of that to kind of see what it is you're inheriting, what kind of foundation you're dealing with, and how you can then build upon that rather than feeling like you need to start from scratch again.
And something that has been super valuable to me when I'm a lone service designer in these Agile teams is reach out to your community. You may be the only service designer on your project, so reach out to fellow service designers or other user-centered design professions who've worked on discovery, alpha, and beyond in project teams to understand their contexts and their lessons learned and what you can apply to your own.
And finally, it can be helpful to compile a list of those potential activities. So by having done all of these steps, pulling out, these are the things I think could be useful, pull that together into a list, and we're going to deep dive into a few that we found useful when working in Alpha and beyond.
So as we've mentioned, we've compiled 7 practical tools that you can use next week, and we're going to dive into these in more detail right now. So, first up, tool number 1, logging the assumptions and developing hypotheses. Back to basics again, an assumption is something we believe to be true but haven't tested, so users will understand this navigation or people will want to upload documents, And the hypothesis is that assumption turned into something testable. We believe users will find the main navigation intuitive because it follows familiar patterns. And we'll know this is true when we see task completion rates above 80% in usability testing. So where do assumptions hide throughout a project? For context, I'll discuss where they were hiding on the Government Digital Application Form project. In Discovery, we were brilliant at logging those assumptions, questioning everything. In Alpha, suddenly we're assuming technical constraints. Legacy systems can't handle real-time updates. And behaviours we make assumptions about too. Users will obviously click the big blue button first, but we weren't logging any of these. And in Beta, we assumed performance. It'll be fine under the load and the adoption. People will just get it. But here's the key insight. Assumptions don't stop after discovery. They just change shape. Every phase brings new uncertainties. So in the project that I was working in, logging became our safety net. A living document in Confluence that travelled with our project. It kept all of us honest about what we knew versus what we were assuming. Plus, it gave us the evidence we needed for those future assessment panels.
Great. So tool number 2 is around developing user stories. Again, just to go over the basics. These should come from needs, which have come out from research as part of your discovery. They usually follow a specific format, which is like as a, insert user need, I need, insert what they need, so that, insert like what it is that they need to do or what impact they need to achieve. They often live together in a spreadsheet in one place so that all of the team can access them and be really familiar around what the needs of their users are. And they can often help kind of focus design activity. And where service design can be really useful when inheriting user stories is by mapping them. Thank you. I'm forgetting I've got the clicker as well. Is by, I don't know why it says a good bird. Sorry, something weird happened to our slides earlier, so there might be some fun stuff that we didn't know was going to be there before that's now there.
Like a good bird.
Yeah, it was just an arrow before. It's really distracting. But yeah, you can map your user stories that you can see in the filled pink boxes below here against your user journey or blueprint that you might have inherited or created at the start of Alpha. It really helps identify like what stages of your journey actually have the most needs, which then may require the most attention or design work or testing, or even like where some of your knowledge gaps are. Like why aren't there needs that we know about across the whole journey? And might we need to do more research to actually find out what those needs are.
And we define that as a good bird.
Yeah, apparently so.
So rapid prototyping should be quick and dirty ways to test assumptions. And this is tool number 3. Service designers should involve the full multidisciplinary team, so not just user-centered designers, but everyone that's on the Agile team. And the outputs don't need to be colourful or functional just yet.
Yep, so as part of the Alpha, I took my service design role to really help direct the strategy and direction of the prototyping that we were doing. So primarily using it as a user research activity, so working with a user researcher, working with our UX designer who mocked up some quick screens or had screenshotted them from other work that we'd done before as a way to start to like gauge appetite around some of our initial ideas and risky assumptions. So for example, we had this assumption as part of our Alpha that like no one liked using spreadsheets, it would be really ugly, too manual, like people couldn't collaborate using them. So instead of us just like going down that path, we decided to use rapid prototyping as a way to put different visuals in front of people and ask them what kind of format they would expect this thing to be in. And surprisingly, a lot of people were like, oh, well, like I work at a council and I'm actually really used to working with a spreadsheet. All my colleagues work in spreadsheets. With Microsoft 365 now, we can actually collaborate on them. So that really helped us kind of take a step back and think we don't need to build a new shiny portal right now. We can work with the basics the people are used to working with, even though as a designer that's a bit heartbreaking. We kind of saved time and money, like following the path that our users were more used to using.
And I have to say that I'm the opposite. As a designer and a librarian, I'm actually like a huge fan of a really good spreadsheet. But I'm now going to take you on to rapid prototyping and storyboarding in beta phase. So this again is the government digital portal project. So the problem that we encountered in beta was that our landing page for returning users wasn't working. People were getting confused, they were making mistakes, and if things stayed the way that they were, the support team was going to be drowning in queries. So the solution was that instead of talking about the problems abstractly, I created lo-fi prototypes for 2 user scenarios. So user type 1, returning users accessing their own application, and user type 2, users accessing both their own and other applications. And these were deliberately rough and fast. I used the NHS and GDS prototyping kits for consistency, and I focused on interaction patterns, not pretty visuals. And here's the key difference. The lo-fi prototypes show what the screen looks like, and then the storyboards showed how real people move through those screens. So instead of saying users experience friction with multiple applications, I could show that the stakeholder, Sarah, she was logged in, looking for her application, but also needing to check her mother's application that she submitted as a proxy. So the power of this approach was that we weren't guessing about user behaviour, we were observing it, iterating quickly, and feeding insights directly to developers. And this is a more concise and easier to deliver version, which was the rapid prototyping in Figma for usability testing in beta for another project. So this was for an R-Shiny dashboard platform that we were building for data analysts in a central government department. So we built on the alpha prototypes and we used Figma. So Figma became the secret weapon for usability testing in beta. And we mapped the complete user journeys with interface prototypes at every stage that our data analysts' experience had touch points we could test with real users. And what made this different was that we weren't testing concepts, we were testing actual workflows with real infrastructure behind them, but we still needed speed to iterate based on user feedback. It meant that I could create the prototypes in hours, not days. And when data analysts and testing got confused about our dashboard request form, I updated the prototype in Figma that afternoon and tested the new version the next day. And now I'm playing around with some AI options for that, and now it's like down to minutes. So we tested the entire end-to-end flow from I need to build a dashboard at the start, right through to the deployment of an interface, and we fed all of that back to developers. So the service design at this stage of the product lifecycle delivered real value in beta because it bridged user needs and technical implementations and ensured that what we built actually would work for the people that would be using it daily.
Great. So another tool which can be helpful is around defining service visions. So if you've not already had one in your discovery, this is a great time to start making one, because post-discovery, this is a really helpful tool to kind of bring teams together, align around what it is everyone's working towards in a couple of punchy sentences, and make sure that everyone's kind of on the same page and going in the same direction. A useful framework for this that I'm sure a lot of people know about is the VMOST one, so the vision, mission, outcomes, strategy, and tactics, with your vision really being that pinnacle at the top of the pyramid with everything else trickling down, but leading back to that. In the project I was part of, we ended up creating a kind of like VMOG model, which was more around the vision, mission, outcomes, and goals, which were really helpful for us to kind of set against our financial year to help to help the team kind of focus all together. And now that that financial year has done, we've refreshed them. So again, just kind of emphasising that all of these things that we're making are never static. They're always worth looking back at, refreshing, and making sure that when new team members come and go, there's still that thing which brings everyone together on the same page.
And now introducing tool number 5, the service blueprints, which quite often get developed in discovery. So you may or may not have one at the end of discovery from your designer. If you do, it will most likely be high level. In alpha and beyond, we're working out and documenting the finer details on how the full end-to-end service will work in reality.
Exactly, and that's what I was lucky enough to inherit from the discovery that I was part of, not part of even, but used as part of the alpha. And I kind of took that and started by mapping, as I showed earlier, the user stories, but also the epics, the problems that we had to really help with that. Those first few meetings around alpha planning, like where should we focus, what should we be starting on, where do we really like harness our energy. As we moved closer from alpha to beta, we kind of quickly realised that that blueprint that I'd inherited was far too high level and almost quite aspirational. And the closer we got to actually piloting this thing with some real people, realised that it was missing some of that key detail. So this is where I mapped it out again in more detail to highlight the other program dependencies that were kind of doing the same thing as we were doing and linked in some way, the supporting documentation that we were hoping to send people, and again, highlighting those areas that we're hoping to like really keep our eye on and test as part of that upcoming piloting stage. I then took it a level further and created like this process map that you can see at the front here with like the 1 step per box type thing, and worked really closely with our product owner to create that together so that we kind of felt like we knew what was happening. It was a really good way to like bring service design thinking and methodologies into product development work. And then it meant that these documents became really useful onboarding materials whenever new team members did join, and meant that I could continually update it based on what we were learning so that the rest of the team could refer back to it and see like what was the current status of the service, where we were at, how had it changed, what did we want to continue to learn and test from.
Now I'm going to take you through transitioning from beta to live. And again, that is
Another good
bird. So random. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the beta service blueprint. So this is not the project that Louise was talking about. This is going back to the data analysts and the Our Shiny dashboard that we are designing the journey for. So in setup, so you have the service blueprint evolution right here from beta to live for the Our Shiny platform. So in the beta blueprint on the left, you'll see it's relatively straightforward. You have the data analysts and their dashboards and the basic request process. And the focus on that blueprint was proving that one concept worked. And as is often the case, it was the happiest path, really, that was captured in the beta. So that's when everything goes right, or we assume everything will go right. And then when you move into the live blueprint, so it's transitioning from beta to live here, as a service designer, I was trying to account for everything that can and will go wrong. So this is a complete end-to-end journey, 7 stages, multiple swim lanes of activity. You've got the front stage, what the data analysts experience, and then you've got backstage the AWS, the Amazon Web Service provisioning, the security, and the deployment. So when you look at those two side by side, at a quick glance, they might seem pretty similar, but the reality is that you can't just scale up the beta processes and blueprints. And when we're moving into live, we had to be honest about the MVP limitations. I would have liked to have done this earlier in the process, but in this particular project, this was the opportunity to do that. So in beta, for example, a Slack message, to the service desk when something was going wrong might have been okay. But when we go live, we really need to start building in automated monitoring and defined response times. And I learned all of that by working hand in hand with the developer and technical architect. So there's assumptions also embedded into the blueprint on the my right-hand side. Data analysts, we had been assuming, would have sufficient GitHub knowledge, and that became a testable assumption that could make or break a live service. So the whole team would start to understand what exactly it is that we're betting on whenever we go live. In terms of risk mitigation, there's a swim lane for risk mitigation, and what we've captured there is what if a request is denied? What if GitHub fails? What then? What if there are performance issues? So in beta, you have edge cases and live operational realities. So the value here in being present to be able to work hand in hand with the developer and the technical architects was that we were able to add real value to transition planning, and the user research almost became like operational blueprints for the team and then for the staff who were going to be supporting and helping to deliver that service experience for users.
Another tool for your belt which might be useful is around how you can capture and measure service impact. So this is admittedly the bit I struggle with the most. I feel like I don't have an analytical brain in that way, but I actually do think it is an area where service designers can add a lot of value, given that our job is around designing services. So I think a helpful starting point here, if you've got your vision that I mentioned, and you go down that level to the outcomes, is linking the KPIs, or your key performance indicators, back to those outcomes. Trying to think of both qualitative and quantitative measures. And as I say, it's those quant ones that make me uncomfortable. So reaching out to the experts that actually know what those are, be those data analysts, your user researchers, even like your product owner probably has experience with these, to think about how you can define what those measures are. And then by having these, you can then start to communicate to your stakeholders the value of the service that you've designed in the first place, particular aspects of it, and start to measure if what you've designed is actually achieving what you'd hoped it would achieve in the first place. And to Christine's point, once you're live, these then become kind of like baseline standards of how you can start to measure how the service is once it's live and commit to continuously improving it. So just because that thing that you've designed and built is now out there in the world, we all know doesn't mean you can then forget about it. Mm-hmm. So in the project I was on, I kind of treated it like any other design tasks. So I got the right people in that virtual room together to kind of come together, look back at the outcomes that we'd already defined a little bit earlier in the project, and then really start to break down, okay, so if these are our outcomes that we're committing to, how are we actually going to measure them? Like, what metrics are we thinking about here? How are we actually going to go about capturing those things? Do we need some data agreements or channels to be able to capture that data? And then ultimately, the tricky bit, who's actually responsible for pulling that data in and making sense of it? And now that our service is live, quite like those aspirational blueprints, we kind of found that a lot of these metrics were aspirational as well. So we're going back and tweaking them to make sure we've got those right methods, formats, channels, people in place, so we can actually start to celebrate the success of this service launch.
And that takes us into tool number 7, translating needs into functional requirements. So taking user research insights and turning them into something that developers and technical architects can build from. So back to basics just for a second. User needs are the underlying problems, goals, or outcomes that users are trying to achieve. They're expressed from the user's perspective and they focus on what they need and why. Sometimes they can be emotional, contextual, and they're usually expressed in everyday language. Functional requirements are specific technical descriptions of how a system should behave to meet those user needs. They define what the system must do in technical terms that developers can build from. As I've come to learn, you can't just hand developers, well, you can, but it's not productive to hand developers a list of user needs and expect them to know what to build. And you can't create functional requirements without understanding the underlying user needs, or you build the wrong thing. The translation process happens when service design can prove their value throughout delivery, because when you don't understand the user needs for the thing that you're building, then obviously what comes out the other end will most likely not work. So as a service designer on these projects, I am systematically converting them into actionable technical requirements. And how do I tend to do this translation? Well, I'm a huge fan of jobs to be done framework, and I applied that to the data analyst user type in the R-Shiny dashboard service. So the 5 key jobs that the data analyst needed to accomplish were: number 1, discovering and accessing relevant data; 2, developing and iterating on dashboards; 3, securely sharing and publishing them; 4, monitoring and maintaining performance; and 5, collaborating with colleagues for feedback. So I visualised this as a storyboard, which you can see on the bottom of the screen, and I showed how real data analysts move through the process of developing an R-Shiny dashboard. And it wasn't theoretical. It captured the workflow patterns that we observed in early research and testing. Each job was mapped to technical capabilities and interface features, and that ensured that no critical workflows were overlooked. And then I broke them down into high-level jobs, into narratives that captured different aspects of what the data analyst needed to do. And this is where it all comes together. I took those narratives, and I was playing Uno with my son a lot around about this time. I was like, how can I make this into like a card deck? Because inspiration can come when you're just not expecting it. I took the narratives and transferred them into a job story card deck for developers and technical architects to work with. It was digital. And the card deck was split into those 5 jobs that the data analyst needed to complete. Each story followed the when I want to sew that format to articulate context, the actions that the analyst needs to take, and the desired outcome. And this approach allowed me to structure user requirements consistently and identify patterns. So instead of developers having to interpret vague user needs on a Miro or a Mural board, they got precise, testable requirements that they could design technical solutions around. And when the developers saw these job story cards, they were able to understand what functionality needed to be built and why it mattered to the user. So this again was service design adding value throughout delivery, keeping user-focused thinking alive through to technical implementation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the outcomes for us in these projects. So what actually happened when we put these 7 tools into practice, and there's more than 7 tools, but we've just focused on the ones that we thought you could implement next week whenever you go back to your project teams. So let me walk you through the real outcomes we saw across our projects. When we implemented the approaches, we started to see a ripple effect on improvements. First, by unifying those 3 separate tracking systems in the government online application portal, transferring them into one coherent approach, we were able to streamline our entire development process and immediately improve team efficiency. And then that streamlined process led directly to clearer requirements. So if you cast your mind back and remember those 62 user stories that were missing the acceptance criteria, we got that sorted, which meant developers finally knew exactly what they needed to build. So there was no more confusion and no more guesswork. And when the developers had the clear requirements, something interesting happened with the stakeholders. The storyboards suddenly made complex interactions simple to understand. So instead of lengthy explanation meetings, we could show stakeholders exactly what users would experience. And that then made decision-making for product owners and delivery managers so much faster. And all of this together enabled us to deliver a successful beta launch. We actually, in the government digital application portal, delivered a refined MVP that genuinely met user needs, not just what we thought they needed. I mean, it wasn't absolutely perfect, but the plan was there to iterate on it, and we had the backlog of user needs to go back to. But because we'd done that rigorous testing, we had proven that the MVP would be able to meet the most basic needs without it breaking the system. But here's the real win. Didn't just deliver the product and walk away, which Louise had said earlier, quite often that happens. We established that process for ongoing improvements, for iterative improvements over time, that the team who were inheriting this service post-go live could continue using long after we'd moved on. We'd created a foundation for iteration that would keep serving users better over time. So the bottom line here was that these aren't just nice to have design activities and tools, they're practical tools that create measurable impact throughout the entire delivery process.
Great. So I hope if there are any service designers in the room today, the next time you do finish a discovery, you don't just hand over your research and walk away. Ask yourself, how can my service design thinking help this team build better, faster, and with fewer headaches? Because this is really where the real impact happens. And it's not that service design isn't needed anymore because our skills are less useful. They actually become much more essential. So we're hoping that now that we've given you 7 practical tools, which span across the alpha and beta stages of Agile, which you might be less familiar with, you can go back to these when you're feeling stuck, and we hope you found them useful, interesting. Maybe some of them felt quite familiar, but hopefully some have been new as well.
And thank you. Thank you very much.